I think that innovation in education is a loaded topic because I'm not quite sure what people mean when they say innovation. And for that matter, I'm not always sure what people mean when they say education. So I'm going to tell you what I think both innovation and education mean, given the experiences that I've had doing international work in the field. So for most of us, education means schooling. And I know what schooling is. Like many of you, I was good at school. My favorite subject was always social studies, because that was the class where the teacher told us stories about real people and their lives, how they work, where they live, the inventions, the wars, how we struggle to make life better, and how we sometimes fail. So I was in awe and wonder at human achievement, and I knew that I always wanted to contribute in some way. Now, I was the kind of kid who always had friends, and school was the place where I saw them. And in fact, what I was learning was not as important to me sometimes as who I was learning with. And so I would engineer the school days so that I could, in math class, sit next to my math best friend, and we would geek out on times tables. And then in art class, I would find a seat closer to the teacher so that I could get the encouragement that I needed to express myself creatively. In 12th grade history, Western civilization class pitted team against team for a year-long competition to demonstrate our knowledge of ancient history. And my team, the Vestal Virgins, was made up of girls who I never spoke to at any other time in the week. Not in the hallways, not in the cafeteria. But in class, we shared a passion and a commitment to learn the material. We would coach each other and quiz each other and make sure that we were motivated to learn so that we could claim our collective victory at the end of the year. Where I learned was also as important to me as who I was learning with. My favorite teacher of all time, Mrs. Hancock, she had a classroom that looked less like a room in a schoolhouse and more like a dorm room meets design studio. Along one wall of the classroom, she had a series of loft-like clubhouses that she called superstructures. And there were 6 superstructures, 3 on the bottom, 3 on top. The bottom superstructures housed overstuffed armchairs and reading lamps and crates of books, and you'd climb a little ladder to the top superstructures where there were shag rugs and beanbag chairs. And during the week, we would choose to work in those spaces or at our desks to finish our classwork, to read a book, to play a board game. So I enjoyed school, and I was good at it. Throughout elementary and high school, I got straight A's, and I always did very well on the yearly standardized tests. But to this day, I never tell people what I got on my SATs, because I always thought it called into question my right to attend the highly selective college that I was accepted to. So this brief archaeology of my own schooling calls attention to 4 questions that matter when we talk about education. Who are learners? What do we want them to know? What do learning spaces look like? And how do you demonstrate achievement? But when we limit our discussion of these questions to the common sense responses, we get stuck. So in forums where we claim to be talking about innovation in education, we need to ask ourselves, what are the consequences if we only think, we, the adult educators, only think of students, learners, as young people in the K-12 population? And what are the consequences if curriculum continues to look like the standard subjects that we've taught across the grades, without making space for new ways of knowing and new ways of putting ideas together? And what are the consequences if we primarily assume that our task is to build better schools and more of them so that more children around the world have an opportunity to go to them. And what are the consequences if we assume that all of this is for the end goal of higher education and employment, after which it's okay to assume that education ends, because presumably we're now ready for the workforce and ready for civic participation in society? If we make these assumptions, we limit our sense of possibility in education. And these responses are not intrinsically wrong. This has obviously been my story in education, and it's served me well. But it doesn't make sense that the education of future generations of learners be guided by the same set of assumptions. I think about how the world is changing, about new technologies and the potential, and the narrowed borders of our globalized world, and the movement of people from rural to urban spaces, and the shift in needs and resources that that creates. It's important that we revisit the assumptions about what education should be, for whom, where it takes place, and how we demonstrate that it's been achieved. Now, I've had an interesting career in the field of education, doing work in New York City and around the world to teach, to design curriculum, to develop educational programs, and then to prepare other educators to do those things. And in that work, I've learned that the way we answer these questions can influence our sense of what is possible and what is not possible. So I'd like to tell you a few examples of that. Let me start with this question of content. What do we teach? I traveled to Afghanistan in 2004 to work on a project to develop textbooks with the Afghanistan Ministry of Education. And along with the expertise and support of international consultants and NGOs, they determined that they'd like these textbooks to center on child-centeredness and critical thinking skills. And it quickly became clear that these ideas of child-centeredness and critical thinking had not necessarily been discussed in the context of Afghan daily life, along with the implications of certain kinds of knowledge within Afghan culture and society, the political meanings of that knowledge. And so what did that tell me about how to think about what do we teach? It taught me that curriculum making and teaching is complex. And it is not just about selecting subject matter. Very often, it's about political points of view, about what we believe education is for, the purpose of education. What kind of citizen and thus society are we trying to support the development of? And so whatever we come up with will represent some social or political point of view, as well as our personal stories about education. So we need to pay attention to the values that get highlighted and those that get left out, and then the conflicts and the tensions that arise in those debates, because it is in that space that there may also be something that is worth teaching. In 2009, I was doing research in South Africa, and I had the privilege of traveling with colleagues from the University of KwaZulu-Natal to a rural village where community members, children, adults, teachers, health workers, and university faculty were convened to talk about the pressing problems in their village and then learn skills of video making as a way to have conversations that were normally challenging to discuss because they were issues that didn't typically come out in the community. So I worked with this small group of students who created an impactful video called Rape in School. It was there that I learned that the words student and teacher are nebulous terms and should always be allowed to shift. This group of young people, who ranged in age from 10 to 19, shared stories, real stories, of feeling at risk and powerless, and hopeful stories about feeling defiant and passionate. I was a learner in that room. I listened. I had skills of video production to share, and together we worked to craft a script and then a 3-minute video, which they screened to their larger community audience. And in that moment, in the presentation of their work, that was a true moment of teaching that those young people owned. So now let's talk about learning spaces. During the past 6 months, I've spent time in London and in Nairobi researching NGOs both in and outside of the education field, trying to understand what social innovation looks like. So what are the new ideas, the new strategies, the new kinds of networks that help to solve social problems? And I've been doing this research with my colleague Nancy Lesko, and we've used this term frequency to talk about the kinds of learning spaces that we see. So we all know the spaces that are bureaucratic, because if you've ever spent time in a traditional school or an office building, you know the expected ways of behaving. You know where to sit, you know when to speak, you know who speaks when, and usually you know how decisions are made, because it's usually according to some kind of hierarchy. And sometimes there are opportunities for the creative frequency to emerge. And that's when there's a little more flexibility and a little more freedom to change the way things are usually done. And so that might look like creative arrangements of school furniture, like superstructures, or a creative use of video, film, media, technology to brainstorm ideas and collaborate. Tuning to the innovative frequency goes a step further and can even transcend physical space, because innovation happens when deep thinking and critique are coupled with action so that more people have a space to determine what problems get discussed and find solutions that might not normally be considered. So innovation enables a certain kind of normalcy to deep thinking, critique, and action. And here's an example. I worked with a small education organization in New York City's Chinatown called Hester Street Collaborative. And they use the principles in the architecture field to encourage community residents, children, adults, the elderly, to suggest needed improvements in their neighborhoods and then execute them. So they call their educational program Ground Up. And here's a picture of them working on much needed signage in a public space that was a wasteland of trash and broken benches until their project revitalized the space according to what they thought was needed. And this is a demonstration of how we might think about outcomes. Because our culture has demanded that evidence of learning be measurable so that we can compare statistics of achievement. And as a result, we've learned to turn away from tangible evidence that is also valid and reliable. It's important that we honor outcomes that are based in real ideas that can be shared and real actions that can be spread to create impact. We have to learn how to assign evidence to that kind of project, because it also comes from the effort of those who have gained knowledge. And so these are the questions that I've learned to continually ask myself to disrupt my own assumptions about education. What should we teach? What kind of knowledge motivates, inspires, and creates different kinds of impact in communities? What kind of knowledge inspires learning across a lifetime? And then what are the consequences of our choices? How does it change our world? Whose ideas about the world benefit from those selections, and whose worldviews lose traction? Who are teachers and learners? Can we limit our discussions about education to just children in the K-12 population, when everyone in our communities has so much to teach and to learn, and especially given that technology has already enabled this shift? And if we open that door, how can we all be better prepared to engage in the discussions about diversity and culture and equity that are sure to arise? And what are learning spaces? Is there potential to see public space, solitary space, as potential learning space? And how do we define achievement? Or is a better question, what is the purpose of education? What is it for? If learning has clearly made a mark on a student and on a community, can it count? Is there a way to capture what Brené Brown has called data with a soul? And can impact be demonstrated in a story or song? These are the kinds of questions that matter. And you may think that improving education is about finding the innovative answers. I think innovation in education is about asking more thoughtful questions. And it is only in that way we'll be able to find new ways to teach and to learn. Thank you.